Welcome back to the Urban Elements studio. Today we're going to be talking about how to advance the quilt and line up the paper panto. We've done this before and we keep getting questions, what if questions or what about. So we're going to go over it again from a different direction. We're going to go over single rows and double row pantos so that it's clear for everyone. And I'm also going to do the paper panto up here with the plexiglass so I could show you on the board, and then we'll actually do them on the frame as well. So I'm going to start with a single row, and this one's called Spiked Swirl, and I'm going to pull you in a little bit closer so you can see it. The name of the panto is Spiked Swirl, and here we have some useful information. This is 6.5 inches high, and they're always 144 inches long, and this is a single row, which means that you're only going to sew one single row and then you're going to roll up the quilt. We have single rows and double rows, and then we have some that are double rows but they're offset. Most of them are double rows that are identical, so they would be exactly like this, as they're just stacked one on top of the other. After we get this in position, and these are echoes that help us, this is what you would line up at the top and bottom. We could use these to fill in the top and bottom of the quilt, but this is also how we reposition. So after we've sewn out our first complete row, and this would be the front of the quilt and this would be the back of the quilt, I would choose any one of these sharp points because those are the easiest to keep track of. I would take my machine and drop the needle right in the quilt, right where that point is that I've already sewn. My laser light would also be in the panto in the back at this position. My needle would be in the stitching in the front of the quilt in this position. And then I would release the clamps on the quilt and I would roll it up so that the quilt would roll back to get it to the next quilting position. And I would watch my laser light, and what the quilt is going to do, the laser light is going to travel until we get to this exact position on the echo. This is where we would start, and this is where we're going to finish. When we get here, we're going to go ahead and lock the quilt back up, the clamps, and tighten it back up and get it smooth and ready to quilt. And then we're going to go back to our start position and we're going to do another row. And we're going to continue that until the quilt is finished, and then we'll fill in the very bottom row as needed. We'll just repeat this process over and over. I'm going to go ahead and get this panto loaded on the machine, and we'll do one stitched out. In order for us to proceed, you must understand that the needle and the laser light are linked as far as distance. So when you move the machine forward, the needle of course moves forward, but also the laser light. Sideways, the laser light moves sideways. They're linked via the machine. So that's going to be how we advance the quilt and get the next placement on our design. I'm going to turn the light back on in the studio so I can see, and I'm going to stitch out this row, and then I'll show you how to advance. We have the first row sewn, and we're at the front of the machine. This is the back of the machine. What we need to do is choose a point anywhere along the front. It can't be in the middle because then we'd only get half of the space we need. has to be on this front line all the way towards us. Any of these points, you don't want to choose a curve because then it's not quite as accurate. But we're going to choose a point. I'm going to choose this one right here in the middle, and I'm going to drop my needle. I'm going to drop my needle right in that point, and I'm going to leave it there. The needle is down through the quilt, so when I release the two locks on the rollers and I roll the quilt, the machine head is going to go with the quilt. So now I don't have to pay attention to the front at all. I just have to pay attention to the laser light in the back, and I'll show you where that needs to go. You can see my laser light is on the corresponding point of the design I just stitched out, and we're going to roll the quilt up, and you'll see this laser light travel down till we get to this echo of that exact same point, that same part of the design. When it gets there, we're going to lock up the two rollers again, and we'll keep tightening them up equally until that laser light is exactly on the tip of that echo design again, and then we're ready to go ahead and go back to our start point and ready to sew the next row. So here we go. Now we would just smooth the quilt out and we can get ready and do the next row. We have the quilt lined up for the next row, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch that out. At the beginning here, you might have seen my machine get caught. Whenever I leave loose threads uncut on top of the quilt, my machine always gets caught in them. They get caught in the hopping foot and they obstruct the flow of the machine. So you can see I did the second row, and the design is nested the way it should be. So this is a single row design. Next, I'm going to roll this up and I'm going to show you how to do a double row design. Okay, that was a single row design. What happens when we have a double row design? Let's come in closer and look at one on the table. This design is 7.5 inches wide. So that is 7.5 inches from here to here. And we have, it's a double row, and it's 144 inches long. And you can see there's two rows here. 1, 2. And we still have our echoes at the top and bottom. So it doesn't matter which way this is loaded on the machine, you would still be able to roll up the quilt regardless of how the panto was loaded. Also, if you bought a panto and you realized you couldn't, your machine wasn't big enough to sew both rows, you still could use this panto because you could just sew one row and advance the quilt. It still would work. If you just sewed one row, you would roll this up by choosing a spot closest to you as we did before, and the spot would be here, and we would drop the needle here, and we would bring the laser light until we got to that corresponding spot here. And if we sewed both rows, we would do the same thing, but we would be choosing on the double row the closest point closest to you, and we would be doing the same thing, dropping the needle and bringing the laser light all the way down to that echo spot. So this is our start. I think that's wrong. And this is our finish. And that's what we're going to do on the quilt as well. And so this is a double row. Both can be stitched, and these actually are a lot quicker when you can do them because you don't have to roll up the quilt as many times, but it all depends on the size of your machine. Also know that Urban Elements can make a custom size panto for you, but you do need to know what the sewable spaces on your machine, and there is a charge for making that custom panto, and they'll mail that to you. And there is they could make a double row like this into a single row. They also could change the size of these patterns to accommodate the size of your machine, but there is a limit to how far up or down they can go. So let's move over to the machine and we'll see what the next one looks like. We have one row sewed out. This is a double row design, but just as if this were a single row design, we would still do the same thing. We would take some point, some part of the design closest to the front of the machine, drop the needle here, and we would roll the quilt up until the laser light got to the echo of the corresponding part of that design. Drop needle, move it to here. But because this is a double row, we're going to just go back and move to the start point over here, and we're going to sew our next row. These two spaces are already lined up for us with the paper panto. It's already done with the printing, so we don't have to do anything on this one. Again, if you needed to have anything changed on a paper panto, you can call the office or email and request a special printing. They will charge you extra for that, but they can upsize them, downsize them, and if they're just exactly stacked one on top of another like this one is, they can make it a single row or a double row from a double row. But if it's an offset one, they can't turn a double into a single because then they won't nest the way they're intended to. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the beginning and sew the second row, and then we'll get into the roll up. As you can see, we have both rows of the double row design sewn out, and you can see we have the space in between our nesting rows, and our goal is to have the same spacing when we advance the quilt. As I said earlier, because these designs are exactly one on top of the other, if you needed to, you could just sew out one row and then advance it, in case like you got to the bottom of the quilt and only needed one more row and you needed to just match up a very small portion to fill in. But this was designed to do 2 rows so that you could advance the quilt and get it done faster. The only difference between doing the double row and the single row is when we roll up the quilt, we're going to be rolling up more of the quilt at a single time. So we're going to choose some spot closest to us to drop our needle into. We don't have a point in this particular quilt, so we're just going to choose a spot on the curve, drop the needle there, and then we can go ahead and get the quilt ready to roll up. We're going to roll up the quilt. You see our laser light is here, and the needle is in the corresponding location in the front. When we roll up the quilt, we're going to go past the second row that we've sewn and to the echo here from the bottom of the design. This is always what we're going to be lining up to, from this all the way down to here. So we are going to be rolling up more of the quilt. That's the only difference from a single row to a double row. The more time you take in getting this dot exactly on that line, the more precise the space is going to be in between your rows to be accurate. So I really like to take my time and straighten the quilt top out, get the batting straight, and make sure that the locks are good on the rolls, but come back and make sure that dot is in the right place. Right now it's a little too close to the back, but after I straighten it out, we'll make sure that it's right on that line before we start again. So we went over the single row. That's of course probably the easiest one to do, and then we went over the double row. The double row, you could sew just a single row of it and roll it up, or sew both rows and roll it up. We do have some offset designs. I don't have one of those in the studio, but with an offset design you do have to sew both rows before advancing, because it's that second row that you would sew that is what is going to line up with the echo at the bottom of the paper of the panto. The height of the where it says 7.5 inch pattern, that is for both rows together. It's not just for one, it's for both. So this particular one says 7.5 inches wide, and I said earlier that's just for one, it's for both. So on the website, when you're looking at a design, I know we tend to look at the pattern and the information right next to the pattern, but underneath the diagram of the pattern is more information. And in that location, you're going to see the size, the designer, and how many rows and repeats there are on that particular panto. So it'll tell you if it's a single row or a double row panto. You can also get a lot of information in our catalog. We currently have about 10,000 different designs that are available, and we've added so many new designers that new designs are literally coming out almost every day. Sometimes a few, sometimes a pretty good handful. Also, many of you may have seen that I had my pantos underneath a pantograph grid. The pantograph grid is like a thick mylar plastic that is gridded, and that gridded line helps you put your pantos underneath very quickly and keep them lined up. It also allows you to edit the panto on both sides of the quilt, so you know where you're stopping and starting. I use a wet erase marker, so I don't have to worry about anything wiping off onto the quilt. And you can also make edit marks at the top and bottom of the quilt when you get to those areas and you need to edit that design. You can also use the pantograph grid to edit out different portions of a panto that you may not want to sew. Maybe a little star or a small little circle that you don't feel confident doing. The pantograph grid is excellent for that as well. One of the things that Patricia in particular is always reminding me. I just do it as a point of nature, but we grow up reading left to right. Even if it's just symbols on road signs or anywhere else, it could be a trail hiking, we read the symbols left to right, emojis left to right, words left to right. So we always set up the panto so that the start is on the left hand side and we sew to the right hand side. I know a lot of times we hear controversy over people saying that the machine doesn't sew one way or another. But if you think about it, that is a bizarre statement, because the machine, long arm machine, is meant to sew in every direction, or otherwise it wouldn't be able to do free motion sewing. If it could only sew in one direction or two directions, it would not be able to do free motion sewing. It would not be able to do ruler work. So if your machine is having problems sewing in one direction, then I would contact your dealer. So that is about it for today. I think I've covered all the bases. Whether you have one row or two rows, the real difference is just how much of the quilt is getting rolled up. There's no difference in where you're putting your dropping your needle in the quilt. It's always going to be the finished sewn design closest to you at the front of the machine, and that's going to be where you drop the needle, and you're going to roll it up to where that echo is in the back. It's always the same. The only difference is how much you're rolling up. So I hope that answered some questions today on advancing the quilt and getting it lined back up. I'm not going to apologize too much about my panto quilting, because I am a digital quilter now. I have a IQ and it does most of my quilting, so I'm terribly out of practice with the following the pantos. So mine would look like a real beginner again. But my point here today is to show you how the process works, not how pretty mine is. Also, I'm using a really dark thread on solid fabric so that you can see what I'm doing. I'm not trying to hide my mistakes. So I hope this was helpful to you. We look forward to seeing you again here in the studio next time. Until then, take care of yourself and take care of each other.